Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. AMD's Threadripper, the high-end desktop platform for consumers who want professional level performance at a reasonable price. In today's video, we're going to be doing a bunch of comparisons. I'm going to talk about first generation and second generation Threadripper. I'm going to be comparing them to the X299 Intel Skylake-X platform. I will also be comparing them to the consumer level processors from both AMD and Intel, talking about who should buy these and where the pros and cons of each platform are, because there are many indeed. Now in front of me, I have a number of motherboards and processors. This is a 1950X 16-core 32-thread first generation Threadripper. It launched for $1,000 about a year and a half ago, but they can currently be had new for close to $500. That is a tremendous value for the money. Next to it, I have the top of the line second generation 2990WX workstation level chip, 32 cores, 64 threads. This thing is a beast, and it should be for $1,700. But for serious users, which we're going to talk about who needs these later in the video, for serious users, this represents a tremendous value for the money. It's not for everybody, but it is pretty impressive. Then you can see I have a couple of consumer level CPUs from Intel, including the new i9-9900K. That's a consumer chip that goes on a Z390, not this X299, but I have it, so it's here to talk about it versus the high-end platforms. Before we get started, I think it's important to talk about what Threadripper really is. Threadripper is Ryzen, but basically more of it. It's the same cores as the Ryzen processors, but you just get more of them. A 1950X, for example, is two Ryzen 7 1800Xs, almost the same clock frequency as well as the 1800X, but just two of them giving you 16 cores, 32 threads. The 2990WX is four Ryzen 7 2700X chips basically on a single. There's actually four separate chips that are underneath the heatsink of this massive processor. It's part of the reason it's expensive and part of the reason because they bend them and take the very best chips in order to make them run at a reasonable power consumption ratio, because this chip does not consume 4 times as much power as a Ryzen 7 2700X. So to do that, they have to take the very best dies to make these chips. Now that's Threadripper. Skylake-X is the same thing on Intel's side. They take the consumer chips, although a generation or two back, rather than Coffee Lake, they're taking Skylake, and they simply put more cores on them. But unlike the dual die platform of Threadripper, these are single dies under there. So their top-end chip is 18 cores, and it's a single large massive die. There are benefits to it in terms of latency and access, etc., but you pay for it. The 18-core processor on Skylake-X is the same price as the 32-core processor on Threadripper. It's not perfect, and it isn't for everybody due to the way the memory access works through half the dies through Infinity Fabric. But if you have programs that can take advantage of it, it is extremely impressive performance for the money. But there are some features on Skylake-X which aren't on Threadripper, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I wanted to talk about what these chips really are to hopefully demystify them. Some of you watching this may not realize that they're just Ryzen cores, there's just more of them. That brings me to the question of who should buy one of these? Should you consider building a Threadripper or Skylake-X system instead of a consumer level machine, a Ryzen, or perhaps a Coffee Lake level machine? If you are a professional level user who makes money with your computer and you either do heavy multitasking, and I don't mean a few Chrome tabs, I mean you have multiple serious programs running at the same time, you run multiple virtual machines, you do content creation like 3D animation, video editing, perhaps you run a YouTube channel and you film your videos in 4K, if you do any type of scientific work, data analysis that requires lots of computational capability, you may very well be the perfect candidate for these processors. For however much more money these cost than the consumer chips, if you're actually doing something that makes money with your computer, they pay for themselves very, very quickly if you need more processing power, if you can make use of more processing power. For most consumers, these are overkill. They're nice, and if you have the money, there's nothing wrong with building one. If you want a super gaming PC with tons of future-proofing built in, and you want to live stream and maybe edit videos and have a ton of windows open at the same time while playing the latest and greatest games, you actually might be a candidate for the replacement for this if you don't mind the price, the 2950X. We'll talk about that in a minute when I compare the different Threadripper chips. It is the second generation version of the 16-core chip, and it's got higher clock speeds, better memory latency, and a few other features versus this. For content creators, the 1950X is a better deal, but if you also want to game and have a premium gaming experience, get the second-gen chip. Do not buy the 2990WX if gaming is a serious consideration. It has memory latency issues and some other things that don't make it ideally suited for that because only 2 of the 4 dies on there have a direct connection to memory. That's why it has the W in the name. It's a workstation chip. It's designed, if you're doing 3D animation, if you're running Blender, if you're editing and encoding videos, it's a great processor. If you want to play the latest and greatest games, don't get one of the W chips. Get one of the X chips, or perhaps just get a consumer level chip, a Ryzen 7 2700X or an i9 9900K, which will cost less, but maybe not have quite so much future in front of them. Now, up till now, I've simply talked about cores and processing power. There are benefits of the high-end desktop platform other than just raw processing power. You also have quad channel memory, and this applies to both Threadripper and Skylake-X. You have quad channel memory for twice the RAM throughput versus the consumer platforms. For most normal people, this is a completely irrelevant factor and does not make any difference to your system's performance. It does if, for example, you're running Blender or a ray tracing application or doing something that involves moving huge amounts of data in and out. You're working with very large data sets, multiple virtual machines, scientific analysis, etc. Then quad channel memory really can make a difference. In fact, on the server platforms, they go up to 8-channel memory. The Epic, the server version of Threadripper, has 8-channel memory for more memory throughput. So that's a benefit for some people, not for gaming, but for non-gaming workstation tasks. There's also more PCI Express lanes. On the consumer platform, you generally have 16 direct to the CPU PCI Express lanes on both the AMD and the Intel side, and then some more that go through the chipset to connect all your various devices. If you need to plug in a lot of add-in cards, if you have need for 4 NVMe SSDs, you have a large amount of data coming in and out, you're working with large data sets, you're rendering large videos, then you definitely want to be on the high-end platform. If you've got 4 NVMe drives in one of the add-in cards that lets you put in 4 NVMe drives, you drop it into an X16 slot, for example, that's going to use 16 PCI Express lanes. And if you want those to run at full speed, then you need those lanes direct to the CPU in addition to what your graphics card and other peripherals and devices need. Threadripper has 64 total PCI Express lanes, 60 to the CPU, 4 directly to the chipset. Skylake-X has up to 44 PCI Express lanes, but those are all direct to the CPU. There are additional platform lanes that cover the USB ports and networking ports and other things that don't necessarily need direct connections. So you can absolutely install a dedicated graphics card, or perhaps 2 or 3 of them, and a bunch of NVMe drives in both of these platforms, whereas you can't, or at least you can't and actually get any decent performance out of them on the consumer platform. On the consumer platform, for example, you can put 2 NVMe drives into your second slot, but it will slow your graphics card down to 8x, and you certainly can't put 4 in there because you don't have enough lanes. So beyond processing performance, if you need more lanes for whatever task that you're doing, that is a huge reason to step up to ththese platforms. I mentioned gaming earlier in the video. Now, it is true that a Skylake-X chip or the 2950X chip on Threadripper would make very good gaming CPUs, and they would last you for many, many years because of all their cores and threads. But they're not ideal. If you really just want to play games and perhaps live stream to Twitch, to be honest, a Ryzen 7 2700X or the i9 9900K are a better value for the money. The motherboards those plug into are less expensive, the processors themselves cost less money, they have higher clock speeds, and I think that's a point that gets overlooked a lot. The Skylake-X chip, the i7 7820X, I have one of those, I've been using it for over a year now to render my videos, has 8 cores, 16 threads. It runs 4 gigahertz on an all-core boost out of the box. You can overclock it, but it gets pretty warm pretty quickly. The i9-9900K is a 4.7 gigahertz all-core speed out of the box, and it's a newer architecture, Coffee Lake versus Skylake. Not a huge difference, but it is a bit newer. And it installs on less expensive motherboards. It's also soldered, so it overclocks to 5 gigahertz without any issues whatsoever. Put a reasonably decent air cooler on there, and you'll get 5 gigahertz without a problem. That's a whole 1 gigahertz faster clock speed on a newer architecture for less money. Same thing with Ryzen. A Ryzen 7 2700X is 8-core 16 threads and is $300. It includes a cooler. These don't. It installs on a $150 motherboard without any issue whatsoever, so that processor is less expensive than even this 1950X, and this on all the cores is going to be running in the mid 3.5 something-ish clock speed range, and it's a first generation chip, versus the 4 to 4.2 gigahertz clock speed you'll get out of a Ryzen 7 2700X. And in fact, in most situations, a 2700X will boost to 4.2 when you're playing games. It's a 4.0 all-core boost in stress testing, but it runs at 4.2. So the increased clock speed and a lower price really makes the consumer platform better if playing games is your key priority. Now, so far in this video, I've touched on some of the differences between Threadripper and Skylake-X. Allow me to be more specific on a couple of those. First of all, Threadripper is by far the value for the money. The pure processing power for every dollar you spend absolutely crushes Skylake-X. There's no question that dollar for dollar you get more processing power with Threadripper than you do with Skylake-X. Mostly, sort of, depending upon what you're doing. Very narrow specific applications are actually faster on Skylake-X because it has AVX512, which Threadripper does not. 99.9% of you aren't going to care, and it isn't going to make any difference. But allow me to give you a simple example. I did these benchmarks back when the first generation Threadripper launched. The 16-core 32-thread 1950X was $1,000 when it launched. The i9-7900 is the 10-core 20-thread processor, and it was $1,000 when it launched. And these two processors launched at about the same time. In H.264 video encoding, standard video encoding that we use for YouTube and for Blu-rays and other content, the 16-core processor is about 20% faster in H.264 encoding than the 10-core 20-thread Skylake-X chip is for the same money. Sounds easy, 20% faster. Actually, it should be faster than that because it's 16 cores, so it's 60% more cores, but lower clock speed, lower efficiency. The per core performance is not quite as high as the Skylake-X, so it's about 20% faster. However, there's something called HVEC, High Efficiency Video Codec, H.265 for short. If you are encoding in H.265, it will use AVX512. The 10-core processor on Skylake-X becomes 20% faster than the 16-core 1950X. It is a tremendous performance jump in that one case. Over time, more programs will start to take advantage of AVX512, but probably not on the consumer side of things. Your latest and greatest game isn't going to use it within the useful lifetime of these processors. The entire marketplace will have to be filled with AVX512 chips before it becomes a common thing for consumers. So don't think you're buying this and go, well, I'm going to be set for 5 years from now. It might be longer than that because the entire spectrum, even the new i9-9900K Coffee Lake refresh, does not have AVX512. Probably the next generation Ice Lake after that will, but it doesn't have it. So I mention it because for a very specific base, it's worth noting that the Intel chip does have features and optimizations that Threadripper doesn't have. But again, this doesn't matter to most of you. For most of you, this is a better deal, especially now that it's less expensive. The fact is this processor is now close to $500, which kind of negates the point because you can buy two of them for the price of one of those. The other thing to consider is that Skylake-X is the standard LGA 2011 socket. Virtually any cooler made in the past 5 years will install on it, any liquid cooler, tower cooler, whatever. It is a standard size chip, and so everything works. These chips are not. Now, We are 18 months post-launch of this. A lot of coolers have come out since then, the Threadripper from Cooler Master and a bunch of other choices. So you have decent cooling options. To be blunt, the first 6 months or so that this was on the market, the cooling options kind of sucked because it's a weird sized chip that nothing was designed for. There were adapters and you could kind of make stuff work, but it didn't cover the die properly and they really weren't great solutions. That's mostly been solved at this point, but if you have an awesome, wonderful custom cooling setup, do keep in mind, it probably works just fine with Skylake-X and it probably doesn't with Threadripper. But if you're buying new, that's less of an issue. Now, for most of you watching my videos, this next point will not matter to you, but it is worth considering because I spent a considerable amount of time dealing with companies, corporations, and conservative-minded managers who made buying decisions based upon what they were comfortable with and what wouldn't get them in trouble from their boss. Buying Intel isn't going to get you into trouble. This is a known, trusted platform on a known, trusted architecture going back many, many years. Skylake-X, Broadwell-E, Haswell-E, Ivy Bridge, Sandy Bridge, and going back from there. A buying manager for a business can buy 20 of these or 50 of these. They can outfit their entire office full of content creators, and they can just know that all of the programs, all the optimizations, Windows, Adobe, Blender, whatever you're running, is all just going to support it. Everything just works with it. There's no teething issues. Now, there are far fewer teething issues today with Ryzen and Threadripper than there were at launch. The first 6 months were interesting, to say the least, and especially with the second generation W chips, the 2990WX, there still are teething issues because of Windows and the scheduler and understanding the memory, and a little bit more development has to happen there. It's gotten better. We're about 6-7 months post-launch from this now, so it's gotten better, but you are dealing with a newer platform that doesn't have a decade-plus development experience behind it. If you are an individual, if you're watching this video thinking, I'm just buying one computer for me and I'm going to use it, or I'm just buying one computer and Bob is going to use it and there's 5 of us in the office and we just need the best value we can get for Bob to do whatever the content or workstation or whatever we're doing, you know what? Threadripper is probably a great choice for you. If you need 1,000 of them, you have to do testing and evaluation and quality control because it would make no sense to buy that many of them. That's why Skylake-X continues to sell. That's why companies continue to buy it, even though it costs more, is for those uses. How many of those people are watching my videos? Probably not very many. But hey, for the one guy out there who's watching, who's asking that question, I wouldn't install Threadripper into a larger organization without doing a lot of validation. Whereas Intel, you still have to do validation, but there's a level of experience and trust going back many, many years, and that is one of the benefits versus Threadripper, even if this is a better deal. Now that we've looked at the two platforms, let's push Skylake-X aside, and instead let's talk about the differences between these two Threadripper processors in detail. I mentioned some of these things at the beginning of the video, but now it's time for a closer look. The 1950X is now 18 months old. In fact, probably sometime in the next 6 to 12 months, we're probably going to get a 3rd generation Threadripper processor, so this won't even have a year before it's 2 generations old. But just because something is 2 generations old does not make it a bad, either a bad processor or a bad deal. As I said at the beginning of this video, this has been available for at or close to $500 for at least a couple of months now. Right around Black Friday 2018, it dropped down to about the $500 point, and it's been between $500 and $600 ever since. The fact that you can buy a high-end desktop processor with 16 cores, 32 threads, with an all-core boost of 4 gigahertz that installs in $250 high-end motherboards, that's incredible. That's absolutely amazing. It wasn't that long ago, just 2 years ago, in fact, that I built the 6-core, 12-thread Broadwell-E machine right here on my channel, the $4,000 Ultimate build. That is the i7-6800K. That processor was $435. The motherboard, the Asus X99 board that it went into, that was $250. This is only about $100 more, and it's 16 cores versus the 6 cores of just 2 years ago. And 64 PCI Express lanes, whereas the Broadwell-E only had 28. That is a huge value jump. That is massive. So what has happened thanks to what AMD has done in the past few years is incredible. So don't look at the 1950X and think, well, it's the first gen chip, it's older, it's 18 months, oh, who would buy that? That's ridiculous. I have one of these downstairs right now running as my primary video editing machine. It's going to continue to be a running machine even with this processor here. Why? Because it's incredibly fast. It's great, it renders quickly, it generates proxies quickly, it scrubs through multiple 4K videos without a problem, it multitasks really well, it's a very nice processor, and installed on a reasonable motherboard, it's a huge value for the money for somebody like me who's a professional content creator since I do this full time. Now the 2950X would be a better choice if you want a dual-purpose machine that is both content creation and gaming. Now, there's nothing wrong with this for gaming. I have played games. I've benchmarked games on this. I don't know whether or not I'll do a video on it. I did some of those mostly just to get my own sphere of knowledge. Let me know in the comments down below if you really want to see a 1950X gaming benchmark video at this point. Let's be honest. Those have been done extensively on YouTube. This is more about my thoughts and positioning on the market than seeing benchmark charts because the chip's 18 months old. However, if I were buying a Threadripper today and I was going to have one primary computer, if I didn't have an office full of computers, then I would buy a 2950X for its higher clock speed and its better optimizations. It's 12 nanometer instead of 14 nanometer. They've improved some of the memory latencies. It's not a huge deal, but it all helps. And then the all-core boost speed is several hundred megahertz higher. And so if I wanted a gaming PC in addition to content creation, I'd spend a couple $100 more and get a 2950X instead. But I have dedicated gaming PCs. This computer is not going to be gaming. This computer is strictly content creation. I have an i9 9900K. I don't need to game on a Threadripper. And for gaming, that is by far a superior platform. Now that brings us to the 2990WX. Yes, you can play games on it. No, you shouldn't. That's not what it's for. And if you have the kind of money to buy this, I certainly hope you have a separate computer for gaming if you're interested in gaming. This is an interesting processor because for basically the same price as the 18-core, 36-thread Skylake-X top-end chip, you're getting yourself 32 cores and 64 threads. However, only half of the cores actually have access to the memory. Because of the architecture of the X399 platform and the way it first came out, 2 of the 4 dies on here have direct access to the system memory and all the peripherals, I/O devices, etc., and the other 2 do not. They have to go through the Infinity Fabric connection through the other dies to get access to the memory, and there's a latency penalty for it. And there are, in fact, some programs which are slower on this 2990WX than they would be on the 16-core chip, because half of the cores do not have access to the system without routing through the other cores. So 16 of the cores are direct access and 16 are not. Now, my understanding is that the Windows scheduler does not actually know how to handle this chip properly yet. The Windows Fall update came out, the Windows 10 update came out too close to the relaunch of this chip, and everything was locked down and it wasn't updated for it. Will the Spring 2019 update fix it? Will the Fall 2019 update fix it? I would imagine at some point. These will become popular enough, development work between AMD and Microsoft will improve, and they will get the scheduler to be aware of it and make sure that programs will become aware of this design, because it's not a typical design of a chip such as the 16-core chip. Interestingly enough, Wendell over at Level 1 Techs has done a bunch of experimentation with these, and if you're interested in Threadripper content, if you're serious about professional level content on Threadripper, I strongly encourage you to follow his channel over at Level 1 Techs, and he's done a bunch of testing, and the short answer is, if you really want to get rid of a lot of the latency issues of this for professional work, Linux is not a bad idea. Linux's kernel and scheduler are better adapted to this, and frankly, it gets more frequent updates than Windows does. Windows still has some teething issues. Now, I'm going to be running Windows on this because we run Adobe Creative Cloud, we use Adobe programs, we use Microsoft Office, we're on the Windows platform. So I will be using Windows on this, and this chip is now just over 6 months old, but things have started to improve, and over time, I'm running under the assumption, we'll see whether it turns out to be true, that everything just continues to get better with time. For what it's worth, that did happen on first generation Ryzen. When Ryzen 7 1700, 1700X, etc. launched back in March of 2017, Adobe did not effectively use all the cores and threads. On my channel, I built a Ryzen 7 1700 machine, and that quickly replaced my Broadwell E machine because I found that the 8 cores, even though they weren't necessarily faster than the Broadwell E cores, the 8 cores were better at scrubbing through video and editing. The whole thing was just a nicer experience. 8 cores really is nice if you're using them. However, I did lose the quad channel RAM, I lost the PCI Express lane, so there was a trade-off there. Threadripper kind of eliminates that and gives you the extra performance. But it was probably 6 months, it was the fall of 2017, before some patches to Windows and patches to Adobe came out, that Ryzen actually started to be more effectively utilized. When I first started using the Ryzen 7 1700, my render performance was no faster than the 6-core Broadwell E. 6 months later, it was. I saw improvements, patches, updates. The entire ecosystem started to better utilize all these processors. I am currently running under the assumption that the same is going to be true here because it's a little bit on the early days for this die design with everything going through two of the dies going through the other 2 in order to get access to the system. But I want more performance. In current rendering, I actually have no problem with Adobe Premiere using all 16 of the cores here, in fact, and then some. It goes deep into the SMT. I'm just going to call it hyperthreading because it's easier. It's a trademarked Intel term, but it's symmetrical multithreading. So SMT works very well with that, and I easily get processor utilizations in the 75 to 85% range when rendering on this. Will I get utilizations that high on the 2990WX? I doubt it. However, if it's even just 50% faster than the 1950X, I will be happy, even though it is more than twice as expensive. In fact, it's 3 times as expensive as this processor. However, even if Adobe is not able to fully effectively utilize all 32 of these cores, my hope or belief is that I will still effectively be able to use the computer while it's rendering, that I'll be able to edit another video, that I'll be able to do other stuff with my PC. With the current 1950X that I'm using downstairs right now, once I set it to rendering, unless I go into Windows Task Scheduler and disable cores to media encoder, if I change the affinity or priority, the system is nearly useless. I mean, you can use it and browse the web and do stuff like that, but I can't get anything else productive done because Adobe is using all 16 cores. You could go the 2 PC route. You could absolutely build 2 of these, except it's worth noting that a computer is more than the price of just the processor. And I've discussed this in many other videos. Your computer is a collection of RAM and storage and power supplies and motherboards and cases and a bunch of other things besides just the processor. So by putting in a high-end processor like this, for as crazy as expensive as it might seem, I basically condense down everything: RAM, high-end SSDs, the motherboard, the video card, monitors, keyboard. I can sit at one PC and get more done even while I'm rendering. That's the logic and thinking behind it. Now, I haven't built this yet. I will. There will be videos on my channel of this. I will talk about it. How much I do on this, I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes because it's way out there from my typical content. And this video is starting to stretch into more of a discussion rather than a comparison, but if you're still watching this video at this point, I imagine a lot of people watch the first 3 or 4 minutes of this video and either they got the point or they lost interest and they've clicked away at this point. If you're still watching, thank you for being here. You genuinely may be interested in this topic, or perhaps you just like my videos and you watch all of them. Thank you. I really do appreciate that, by the way. Percentage of video watch time does matter in YouTube analytics. So if you are watching this, you are helping. So that's the purpose of this. I'm not going to talk about what I'm going to do with the Skylake-X videos at this point because I'm going to talk about that and do a little bit more discussion of what I'm going to use those for when I actually do the build of this. The purpose of this video is more to give an update on the status of these chips, who they're for, what you should or should not use them for, what I'm going to be using them for, the fact that this has become an incredible value in terms of price. I mean, just over $500 for 16 cores on a quad channel platform with 64 PCI Express lanes. Holy smokes, that's a deal. Last but certainly not least, somebody in the comment section is bound to say, but wait a minute, isn't Ryzen 3rd Gen just around the corner? Isn't that coming in the summer of 2019, probably around Computex? Yes, it is. Well, I heard it was going to have 16 cores. Yes, it probably will. We don't know the price, we don't know the clock speed, and we don't know exactly when those are coming. In fact, 16 cores is not officially confirmed on Ryzen 3rd Gen, although I expect it to come. I think everybody at this point expects it to come. It's worth noting that 16 cores will give you more multi-threaded performance to a point, and it will be faster on a per core basis versus a 1950X or even a 2950X. However, 64 PCI Express lanes and quad channel RAM. That's the one big thing I think a lot of people will miss when the 16-core Ryzen 3rd Gen comes out, whether it's Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9. I'll be shocked if they don't call it Ryzen 9 to compete with the i9. But if we get a 16-core 32-thread Ryzen 9 3rd generation chip, first of all, expect it to cost $500. I don't think it's going to be $200 or $300. That's just crazy. But even if it's $499 and it's a higher clock speed than this, it's only going to have the 16 PCI Express lanes of the consumer platform. It's only going to have dual channel RAM. And if you're working with large data sets, that matters. If the processor is starved for information because your dual channel RAM and your PCI Express lanes don't allow you to have enough data throughput, then the processor is going to sit there idle at times. Now, that's not going to apply to gaming. That's not going to apply to live streaming. That's not going to apply to most consumers. But there will be a 3rd generation Threadripper as well, which will get the same benefits of higher clock speed and higher performance, etc. And I imagine it'll work in these same motherboards as well. So that'll probably come out probably fall 2019. I'd imagine September, October timeframe. Just guessing. But for those of you asking about the 16-core Ryzen 3rd Gen, just keep in mind, yes, most consumers should buy that over this, but high-end desktop versus consumer. Thank you all so much for watching this video discussing the differences of the various platforms. Hopefully you found it interesting, useful, informative, or amusing. The comment section down below, let me know what you thought of this. What additional content on high-end desktop platforms would you like to see? I can't respond to every comment down below, but I promise you I do read them, and they are all appreciated. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions, comment section. Check the links in the video description. Everything up here will be linked to Amazon and Newegg down there. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. While I have been sent some of this stuff by the manufacturer, AMD did not send me this processor, so I could really use your support. If you use those links when shopping, it doesn't cost you anything extra, and I'd be greatly appreciative. My social media links and some other things are down there as well. Thank you all so very much for watching. I will see all of you next time.